What if Starship revisited their acid rock roots in '85? This week I'll be taking a little look at a band who in some ways epitomised the slickness of '80s corporate rock despite having very solid roots going all the way back to 1960s counterculture. I'll also be tracing away back to those roots to take a little look at the Jefferson Airplane, San Francisco's legendary acid rock pioneers. All that and more on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hi, my name's Morgan Brown, and every Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel, and then on Wednesday follow it with one of these companion videos where I discuss the artists and genres involved in the What If video, and also share a little bit of my creative process. The idea of the What Ifs is that each week I pick a popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I have around the house in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was We Built This City by Starship, and I attempted to reimagine that in the acid rock style of Starship's forebears, the Jefferson Airplane. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster.
We just want to dance here. Someone stole the stage. They call us irresponsible. Write us on the page. Mom Cody plays the mama. Listen to the radio. Don't you remember? We built this city. We built this city on rock and roll. We built this city.
The story of the Jefferson Airplane and their assorted spin-off bands is a long, convoluted and fascinating one. Obviously, these days, it's the airplane whose legend looms largest. But for a lot of people of my age, Starship were the band that made a big impact on us long before quite often we ever heard of the Jefferson Airplane. And their big 80s hits were pretty unavoidable. It really had that slick MTV-ready sound that totally epitomised that mid to late 80s era. And I think if you'd told me when I was a kid that they had a lineage that went back to experimental 1960s psychedelic rock, I think I would have probably struggled to believe you. Well, Starship as its own entity starts in 1984. I guess at that point Jefferson Starship had been operating for around a decade, formed from the remnants of the Jefferson Airplane, and they'd been doing very well for themselves. Had a fairly frequently revolving lineup, but always centred around the core of Grace Slick and Paul Kantner from the classic Airplane lineup, with Marty Balin as well joining the band around 1975, I think. And it had a sound that had some clear roots in the Airplane's kind of psychedelic rock, but increasingly moved towards a more mainstream 70s hard rock sound. Trouble really starts to emerge as they get more into the 1980s. Obviously, fashions change, different sounds become popular, and the band starts gravitating more towards a lighter, slicker AOR sound, which most of them are on board with, but Paul Kantner absolutely wasn't. I think tensions really came to a head on the Nuclear Furniture album, which I don't know much about it, but I think there was some crazy story with Kantner actually being so upset with the direction the album was taking that he stole the master tapes and ran away with them for a spell. And the upshot being that due to this disagreement about the direction of the band, Paul Kantner left, leaving Grace Slick by that stage as the only classic Jefferson Airplane lineup member still in the band, and not actually even an original Jefferson Airplane member, having not performed on the first album. So legal shenanigans follow as Kantner questions whether it's legal for them to continue calling themselves Jefferson Starship when the connection to Jefferson Airplane has been greatly reduced. And the compromise they eventually reach is that the band will thenceforth just be known as Starship. So from 1984 they relaunched as this new band, and particularly with the Jefferson bit being removed from the name, they no longer feel any obligation to hark back to their classic sound, and they really do lean into that slick radio-friendly sound. So that debut Starship album, Knee Deep in the Hoopla, which contains We Built This City, is a real sort of culmination of this new approach. Very produced, very glossy. There's still some guitars in there, but it's extremely heavily synthesized sound. The drums are electronic drums, it's like Simmons drums, walls of synth, played by Peter Wolf, who co-produced the album and also had a hand in writing a bunch of the songs, including We Built the City. So a very contemporary 80s soft rock sound, pretty much entirely, I think, written by outside songwriters. Maybe Mickey Thomas has one co-write on there, but the rest of it is all the work of pros, and it's all very much about making hits, which they did with some aplomb. There were a few hit singles from that record, but the one that I've always particularly remembered was We Built This City, which was very successful at the time, has not been particularly fondly remembered by a lot of folk. I've definitely seen it topping a bunch of worst song ever polls, which feels a little harsh to me. I definitely get that it falls into that sort of slightly smug boomer rock category that also includes things like Kokomo by the Beach Boys. There's a little bit of a sense of self-satisfaction about it that's hard to shake off. And there's a sort of grim irony to the fact that the lyrics seem to be espousing a sort of rebellious anti-establishment stance, harking back to obviously the countercultural days of the 60s, and yet the sound is the exact opposite of that. So I get that people find that a bit grating. Also, it's not one of Bernie Taupin's strongest lyrics by any stretch of the imagination. There are a few clangers in there too, but nevertheless, it's irresistibly catchy. And I was bopping along to it as a kid before I had any of this sort of broader cultural context to find a reason to sneer at it, so I can't hate it even now, I must admit. But yeah, so whether or not the old Airplane fans approved of the direction, it was a pretty impressive commercial start, at least for Starship. And the follow-up album did pretty well too, certainly bolstered by Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now, which was the theme from the movie Mannequin and was absolutely inescapable at the time, I seem to recall. So they were riding pretty high off the back of that, but then there was a fairly major spanner in the works when Grace Slick was invited to join a reforming Jefferson Airplane, which she agreed to do, thus leaving Starship without anyone with a Jefferson Airplane connection whatsoever, and with Mickey Thomas as the sole lead singer. But fair play to him, he didn't let that deter him, he's just carried straight on and has kept a version of Starship going ever since, as is a recurring theme with the various iterations of these bands throughout the years. There were some legal wranglings. I think at least for a time he's had to bill the band as Mickey Thomas's Starship or Starship featuring Mickey Thomas, as there've been some disputes as to whether or not he has the rights to the name. And then things have got even more confusing in more recent years as a reformed version of Jefferson Starship appeared, which was restarted by Paul Kantner and has featured various classic Starship and Airplane alumni over the years, further complicating matters. And I think Jefferson Starship now still exists as well, although without any original members, but they've certainly continued with the blessing of Grace Slick, who's also, I think, contributed some material to them, despite having retired from performance years ago after the Jefferson Airplane reunion and tour. So these days, if you do want to see some version of that band, there is an active Starship and a Jefferson Starship to choose from, neither of which any longer have any discernible connection back to the band that started it all, the Jefferson Airplane. The Airplane are one of those curious bands that are, for a lot of folk, particularly associated with a signature sound and the charismatic lead singer, but who actually began without either of those things. The first Jefferson Airplane album, Jefferson Airplane Takes Off, although there are elements that you can hear carrying on into later Airplane music, is a much more restrained affair than the later stuff, definitely showing their folk and blues roots and some jazz leanings as well, a lot more than the later material. And while for a lot of people Grace Slick is definitively the face and voice of the Jefferson Airplane, the female lead singer on the first album is actually Signe Tully Anderson, who was doing a perfectly respectable job but became a mother shortly after releasing that first album and fairly quickly realised that trying to raise a kid whilst also being in a touring rock band was not going to be feasible. So they quickly look around and recruited Grace Slick, who at the time is fronting a band called The Great Society, and it's when Grace arrives that the band really kind of clicks into place, helped by the fact that she brought with her a couple of songs from a previous band, both of which were actually written by her brother-in-law, which went on to become signature songs of the Jefferson Airplane, those being White Rabbit and Somebody to Love. And they come out with Surrealistic Pillow, which is where the Jefferson Airplane sound really starts to take shape. You've still got hints of those kind of folk and blues and jazz roots coming through, but already showing a much wilder, broader, more experimental approach. It had the unique advantage really of having a number of songwriters who all had their own separate influences and really quite distinctive approaches, and two strong lead singers in Grace Slick and Marty Balin. So they were able to produce a really fascinating, multifaceted sound, which only expanded on further releases. After Bathing at Baxter's goes much further into harder psychedelia, more expansive improvisation, longer pieces, heavier guitar work. And from that point on, for a few years, it made a string of great records that really helped to define that era. Records that were not only musically ambitious and experimental, but also pretty politically radical sometimes too. I mean, the album Volunteers particularly had some lyrics that nearly got it barred from release by the record label, using lyrics inspired by slogans from anarchist groups like the Angry Brigade and stuff like that. So pretty radical stuff. Unfortunately, although they had an incredible little 4-year period during which they made notable appearances at 3 of the most iconic festivals of the psychedelic era, those being the Monterey Pop Festival, Woodstock, and the ill-fated Altamont Festival. By 1970, the cracks were really showing. I think Spencer Dryden, I can't remember if he was asked to leave the band or whether he just chose to leave, having become both burnt out from doing acid all the time and also completely disillusioned with the ideals of the whole hippie scene. I think for quite a few years at this point, Jorma Kaukonen and a couple of the other guys had been doing their own blues band, Hot Tuna, on the side. He decides to take that on as a full-time gig, so Hot Tuna splits away. And then the last few years of the Airplane are really a bit of a decline. They try and keep it going for a few years, but the momentum's obviously gone by the time you're a couple of years into the 70s. And they eventually dissolve, but then a couple of years later re-emerge with the Jefferson Starship to continue their legacy into the 70s and beyond. And that could have been it for the Jefferson Airplane, but for their decision to reunite many years later in 1989. And it's a very strange thing, that reunion album. It brings together almost all of the classic 67 to 70 lineup, but minus Spencer Dryden, who is still not on good terms with the rest of the band. So the first worrying sign is that instead of Spencer Dryden on drums, you've got Kenny Aronoff, who not only doesn't have that swinging classic 60s drummer feel that you'd look for from a Jefferson Airplane record, but who in many ways to me is one of the most sort of definitively 80s drummers. Just thinking of like things like his drums on Jack and Diane by John Mellencamp. To me, that's the last thing you want to have going on in a Jefferson Airplane record. And then, although they've got most of the classic band back together, in terms of the production of the record, in terms of the creation of the record, it's still very much 1980s production values, which I think Jorma Kaukonen was immediately repelled by. So, although there are recognisable Airplane traits, they've still got those trademark harmonies, although a little bit more ragged around the edges. They still sound great. There's still some interesting songwriting here and there. The whole thing does come out as a bit of a soulless 1980s product. It's absolutely covered in session players, loads of extra keyboards, extra guitars, and sometimes it's a bit hard to actually find the Airplane within this swath of 80s-ness. I think although expectations were high for it, it only performed moderately well. They toured with it and I think the tour did pretty well, but then after that, Grace Slick made some very pointed statement about old people don't belong on stage and promptly retired from performance, never to be properly coaxed back out again. So it was a bit of an inauspicious end for the Airplane, really. But it doesn't really tarnish their legacy at all. There's such a great run of records from 66 through to 70, and even some great stuff on the ones after that too, that their legend was more than assured already by that point, to be honest. But yeah, anyway, that takes me up to this week's alternative universe scenario. So in my alternate timeline this week, it's 1985, and Starship are in the process of relaunching themselves following Paul Kantner's acrimonious departure from the Jefferson Starship. And their initial plan is just to sort of continue very much in the direction that they were going with the Nuclear Furniture album, moving into this smooth, slick AOR direction. And they start recording that way, but in the back of Grace Slick's mind, she can't quite escape Kantner's stinging criticism of that sound. Can't help but feel that maybe she's just drifted too far from her musical roots. So in an effort to redress the balance, she gets to the studio before everyone else one day and decks the entire place out in psychedelic artwork and dims the lighting and puts lava lamps lamps up everywhere to create this psychedelic atmosphere. And when the rest of the band roll in, she greets them with little cups of orange juice liberally laced with LSD, which they all gladly drink. And soon, when that takes effect, the recording session starts to take a very different direction. And the song that they've been working on, We Built the City, goes from being this slick, catchy corporate rock number to being this Latin-tinged, hazy, acid rock track with these meandering guitar solos and these exotic-sounding chord sequences. And they're very happy with the result, so they released the record. Unfortunately, commercial radio refuses to play it, MTV won't touch it, and the record bombs. But they do find acceptance within the Paisley Underground movement, an up-and-coming movement of young musicians inspired by 60s psychedelia who welcome this new version of Starship with open arms. So, in attempting to convert We Built the City into a Jefferson Airplane style track, my first step as ever was just getting the isolated vocals, dropping them into GarageBand and syncing up to the grid. I decided that the particular airplane sound, because they had a bunch of different styles that they could dip into, as I say, they were quite multifaceted. The style I was going to go for was something a bit along the lines of White Rabbit. So in order to do that, I decided I needed to slow things down a little bit for that sort of slow, menacing, slightly Latin American tinged feel. I also cut some chunks out of it because there are bits of repetition and things that weren't really necessary in a song that was already going to be quite long. Next thing was putting some drums on there. So didn't want to exactly replicate the groove from White Rabbit, but I did want something with that similar slightly Latin offbeat feel. So got that sort of syncopated snare motif in the verses and then going into a bit more of a kind of standard 60s rock thing in the choruses as well. Put some bass on next. Bass heavy, not too much treble, quite a lot of gain for that big fat Jack Cassidy sound. Played with my fingers. Again, just trying to lean into a bit of a Latin American inspired feel for the verses and then going into a much more kind of straight ahead rock feel for the choruses. In terms of the chord structure, the original song has got such a bright kind of classic pop feel to it, which would not have been at all compatible with the mood I was trying to evoke. So I dispensed with all the original chord structure and came up with my own harmony, which is trying to at least be a little bit more exotic and unexpected, which I think worked out alright, particularly in the verses. I think they kind of have a bit more of that slightly exotic White Rabbit feel to them. Added some guitars next, ended up putting on 4 guitars, so 2 rhythm guitars, panned hard left and right. I did consider doing more of a kind of experimental early airplane style production with the drums over on one side and the vocals over on the other, that kind of thing, but it just sounded weird and not in a good way. So just rhythm guitar on either side, slightly different sounds, one a bit brighter, one a bit fuller and darker. And those are mainly just playing the chords in slightly different ways. One of them is a bit more strummy, one of them is a bit more choppy. And then I added 2 lead guitars, one of which is quite a lot cleaner and a bit reverby, which was trying to sound a bit like the lead guitar on White Rabbit. And then the other one of which has much more of a kind of 60s psychedelic fuzz tone to it, which isn't on White Rabbit, but you do hear on a bunch of airplane stuff, which I thought really lent more into the acid rock thing when we get further into the track. And in terms of what I was actually playing, I was going for that acid rock blend where there's a bit of blues in there, but there's also some kind of Eastern scales, some modal stuff, and some hints of jazz as well. And those just meander in around the vocal, just filling in any space that's there on the track. And then the last couple of touches were I added a bit of organ. I know Grace Slick played piano and organ on a bunch of those old airplane records. I thought organ would fit nicely with the tone I was going for. It doesn't do very much, but it's just another texture in there that builds things up as the track develops along and just adds a bit to the harmony as well. And finally added just a little bit of tambourine just to bolster the rhythm when we get into the chorus and just add a bit more emphasis to that. Then for the video, as ever, started out by just finding some good live footage of Starship performing the song back in the day. I think it's an old MTV concert or something. They look very 80s and their instruments are very 80s, so I tried to intercut that with some footage of the airplane's instruments from 1967 just to make it look like, you know, they're playing something psychedelic rather than that they're playing the slickest mid-80s sound possible. And then to get a bit more of that period atmosphere, to evoke that psychedelic 60s feel, I just found a load of old archive footage of hippies doing their thing in Haight-Ashbury back in the latter half of the 60s, and also some shots of people just milling around at the Monterey Pop Festival too, and just intercut those in between the performance bits just to give a nice kind of feeling of that psychedelic era. So I hope you enjoyed this one. It was a really enjoyable challenge for me trying to take this most emblematically 80s of songs and turn it into something that sounded like a whole different era. I don't know how successful I was. It's a tricky one, but it was good fun trying it, and, you know, hopefully at least it's been entertaining for people. If you did enjoy it, let me know what you think down in the comments, and if you could like, share, subscribe, that would be great. The algorithm's been absolutely battering me recently, so anything you can do to boost the channel would be greatly appreciated. If there's anything you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months, any artists or songs or genres you'd like me to investigate, I always welcome your suggestions. But otherwise, that's all from me for this week, so thanks very much indeed for watching, and I'll hope to see you next time.